Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the third video of the Read Aloud vid series for the new dark paranormal fantasy book, The Violet Curse. For disclaimers and extra information, view the first video in this series. You can find the rest of the videos for this book on my YouTube channel, 7 Bloodfire Art and Story. For more information about the books and the author, visit 7bloodfire.com and follow me on social media under the handle 7bloodfire. In the previous video, we enjoyed the prologue, which was titled A Dark Dream. In this one, we will start with the map again. This time, the yellow highlight shows Five Tower, Black Temple, Crow Post, and some of the forest outside of Crow Post. The focus will be on Five Tower, which is the bane of many characters and the source location for many schemes. This chapter is one of the few that switches POVs mid-chapter with section breaks. To begin, we will start with Chapter 1, Bright Night. Gina pulled her coat tighter about herself as she clutched her 2-year-old son. She was desperate to keep the stinging cold from him as she turned her back to the worst of the explosive gusts. Her face felt numb, burned where the keening wind raked icy spurs across her skin. She shut her eyes as the howling became a deafening roar, as particles of ice lashed and bit and scratched and blinded her. She bowed her head and breathed against her precious bundle. Below, a horde of the wolf shadow of cultists waited for them to fall. She could sometimes still see their bonfires and their torches. Getting closer every hour were their most vicious and determined priest hunters, the descendants of the moon, who braved the climb after the 3 of them with picks made from the bones of the dead they had eaten. "Come on, Gina," her husband barked, and the vengeful north wind ripped his voice from him. She looked up as John knelt to give her his hand. Her every breath ached with cold. The moisture that had beaded on John's forehead and gathered in his shaggy, bronze-colored beard had frozen, and chalky crystals clung to his wild, unkempt hair. His breath steamed the air white in the sagging lulls between the angry bursts of the blizzard. She reached out. Then she felt her feet slipping. Her heart did a somersault in her chest as panic gripped her. For a long moment, the world began to teeter and tilt upon its edge. Another strong gust slithered around her, and then it yanked. John's grip was firm as he caught her wrist with his gloveless left hand. The rough skin across his palm had cracked and blistered during their relentless ascent. Then mad laughter hacked its way up the cliffside as a wolfman's filthy, child-killing fingers clawed at her ankles. "Come here, Angel! Come here! We'll make it fly! 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 Let us have that boy to eat! Let us have that bright and blessed child!" Some of the wreckage about them crumbled and plummeted hundreds of feet down the cliffside as she struggled against him, and Gina held her son, shielded him. John tried to draw his dagger to fight the man, but the wild-eyed, fur-cowled cannibal tumbled closer as the debris crashed around them. Blood leaped slowly from the open flesh where the ice cut John's hand again. His teeth snapped against a bark of pain, and the vibrations from the shifting wreckage crawled through the steel beams and made the rubble beneath them writhe. But the laughing madman slipped suddenly, and then he was gone. The wind rendered his screams mute. Yet the danger was no less with his absence. Not for how the ground still trembled, slick with ice and burdened with the white atop it. The mountain groaned as though to wake, to cast off the heavy blanket, to free itself of a burden both unwelcome and unnatural. John drew Gina to him and held her close, and he wrapped himself around her to protect her as chaos fell from above. He held her desperately as he helped her regain her feet and pulled her from the path of falling debris. The fleeting warmth of his breath cut through the cold for just a moment when he drew her closer to reassure her, and he pressed his lips against her forehead and said her name. He cupped her face as the dangerous quaking began to subside, and she saw the blood on his hand, had already frozen. "Are you all right?" he rasped. She nodded against him, shivering, and she leaned into the kiss he placed upon the crown of her head. His glittering azure eyes flitted to their son, and when he was assured of Jamie's health, he tilted his head back to look upward intently. Gina's concern for her husband only grew. She felt the tremors that racked him as they traveled through his arms and into his hands. He was exhausted. And this climb had been especially difficult for him because he hadn't eaten well for days, because he had already given his rations to her and to their son. They also hadn't had the time to tend to his wounds properly. Even now, it was dangerous to stop for long because more of the wreckage gave away every hour and because more wolfmen gained ground up the nearly vertical terrain. John was exhausted, and the cold was getting to him. Even if he was too proud and too worried to voice his weariness, Gina saw the strain. John braced his feet as Gina clasped his hands tighter, and he heaved with all his strength, lifting her from the icy stairway the wreckage had formed. Once she made it onto the ledge where he stood, at the very apex of the city, once her knees were scraping across the stone and crunching in the snow, John let his breath hiss through his teeth, and then he let her go. He staggered back, straightening, and Gina climbed away from the edge before daring to peer down again. They had about a half a day before the other wolfmen made it up the cliff, maybe longer, if that avalanche of stone and metal and ice had scattered the horrible men below. "Those murderous wolf-shadow swine!" John swore. He spat the snow as another string of vile cursing highlighted the cult's worship and the child-murdering practices. "I can't believe the cowards sent the descendants of the moon after us." He stooped to loosen from the icy ground a jagged bit of stone, and he hurled it downward into the storm, and more curses lashed from his tongue mightily. "Saura will hear of this wretched cult's attempts against us, Gina." Gina shuddered as she dared to peer over the cliff. She couldn't see the ground anymore. The snow had washed it away. Clouds of snow, rivers of it. It was like a white ocean stretching below them, its giant white waves tossing about them and rising tall above them. The storm was monstrous in its intensity. When at last Gina's husband turned from the sea of white, so did she. John's scrutinizing blue gaze searched about them, dark with uncertainty. From the billowing sheets of snow that fell about them as they sorted their way into the still-steaming wreckage of Five Tower, a limping old man with decrepit, oil-stained clothes and a balding, capless head came scuttling forward directly for them. John's glare warned them, and the man paused with a cautious, frosted scowl. As the old man watched them, they entered the protective bulwark of broken buildings, crumbling curtain walls, and high towers. At last, the storm's freezing fingers broke from around them, and the snow drifted down more slowly upon them. The tempest beyond continued to scream through the spires above. It howled with warning from the cliffside beyond the wall of wreckage. The cold seemed to lessen as the world became still. The only furious movement remaining about them was the white breath of the pale, deathly ocean itself, where the storm washed over the cliffs behind the wall. In the middle of Five Tower, the dust and the smoke were still thick in the air from the explosion 3 nights before. Ash coated the snow, a blanket of gray and black still staining the white. The blizzard hadn't yet been able to erase the event that had rocked the wicked, now crippled city. Gina watched her husband's eyes scan the snow and the debris before she concluded that he could not see any bodies either. Gina bent over double, coughing when the cloth wound around her face slipped. The smoke was too much to inhale after the spiteful, freezing wind. It was more than she could yet endure. She replaced the cloth quickly. John simply grimaced, the skin around his eyes tightening as he gazed about, still searching. Cries came from the depths of the haze. Wounded people. Coughing. He hesitated as he took it all in, and then he moved forward. Snow and ash crunched underfoot over what might have been glass. "Stop," she signed. "Stop." But her husband did not see her hand flutter urgently. Gina reached to tug at his torn sleeve. Her eyes slid across the clearing where the road used to be and fell upon the giant crater. They shone red through the acrid smoke. They were here at the eye. John started forward cautiously as the boy's cries rang out. His frozen fingers curled and uncurled over the bony hilt of his lengthy dagger.
"Mama!"
the boy cried.
"Someone help my mom! Please help us! Please, someone help my mom and me!"
"Hello!" shouted John. "Where are you?" The boy's continuing cries cut deep into John's heart.
"Help!"
said the boy.
"Someone help us!"
"Where are you?" But the boy's cries cut off, suddenly silent. "Where are you?" repeated John more loudly. There was no reply. He could smell scorched flesh, but he couldn't see very far through the gray veil. The faintest outlines of the two remaining skyscrapers towered over him, reaching high into the pale, blurry heavens. The soft tinkling of glass falling and breaking sounded occasionally over the dying howls of the wind. The storm seemed to be abating. The streets also seemed deserted, and John did not know what to make of the devastation that slowly cascaded into view between the high drifts. Peeking through the low banks, the grass and the trees that had taken root over the years were scorched. And, in places, the pavement was melted to what appeared to be black glass. Snow covered the rest, but he knew it was bad. Very bad. This was where he and Gina had seen the violet-colored explosion 3 nights ago, when they had been making their way over the tall hills to the west. The glass shattered in the explosion had looked like violet starfall, like purple diamonds raining down from the black ocean above. The blast had been so powerful that it had crippled the foundations of 3 of the 5 buildings in 5 Tower. They had collapsed inward, one upon another. 5 Tower had no longer had 5 imposing towers. There were only the broken fangs on the north side of the complex. There would be no shelter in them anymore, not with that dangerous teetering about them. The biggest settlement for hundreds of miles, home to several thousand people, in ruins. But where were all the survivors? John was overcome by the sight he beheld, above him, around him. He looked at his wife, and he signed for her to stay where she was as he motioned forward at the deadly trap above that loomed over them. The beams of one of the fallen towers groaned hundreds of feet over him. His pulse quickened. Rubble began to fall from the sky. The boy's cries raked through the veil of falling snow once more.
"Mama!"
John couldn't see the child or the child's mother, but something else did draw him, and it wasn't the crater that made him start forward with horror swelling dangerously within him. "Stay here," John rasped, holding his shoddy makeshift respirator to his face. Gina nodded, though she knew he wouldn't have seen her do so. She pulled her gun from the holster strapped to her left thigh and moved forward, and she put her back against the large concrete pillar so no stranger could slip behind her unnoticed as she blended into the bluish gray there. She watched. Her gaze flitted side to side, searching for movement that was not in sync with the falling snow. Occasionally, she looked up and searched the remaining tower's shadows for life, for threats. Her husband moved with every confidence that she would guard his back, that she would kill any strangers who might try to ambush him in the middle of the ruined ancient highway. The old man scuttled across the street, his bad limp making him appear to hop and shuffle in a manner similar to the twisted, waddling gait of a hideous, tattered vulture. His head bobbed up and down, much the same, but it always seemed tilted in their direction. Their tiny son stirred against Gina's breast. "Shh," It was very nearly the extent of her ability to speak, and she repeated it as she rocked him, cupped his blanketed head, and pressed her lips against the cold material there. Shh. The gaunt old man had crawled back into his snowy tunnels, but she could see the bearded stranger peering out as John passed by him, jogging toward the crater. There was someone else in the dark hole with the old man, but Gina could not discern whether the other person was old or young, or man or woman. It was just a motion, a silhouette against a reflection. "Don't touch it!" the old buzzardly man screamed as he suddenly raced back outside. The old man gripped massive handfuls of his beard and wrung the peppery hair nervously, ready to dart away when John went to his knees at the center of the crater. "Don't touch it, lest its curse manifest, you fool! Get away from it!" Gina's attention snapped toward her husband's muted cry. "What in the hell?" cried John. "Gina!" He quickly dropped his pack and began shrugging off his black leather jacket, no longer mindful of the threadbare seams that needed repair, and not in the least worried about himself freezing. Gina's heart skipped as anxiety filtered in. She shivered when her husband next barked urgently, "Gina, come here at once!" John glared at the old man with a disturbed gleam in his eyes. The look made Gina more concerned. Her husband was a strong man, a man with enduring nerve and a strong sense of duty and compassion. He'd amputated tainted flesh from children to save them. He had sung softly to them to soothe some of the agony afterward when his pack had been emptied of pain medication, and neither his hand nor his voice had ever wavered when he had been presented with impossible situations. He had always acted quickly. He had tolerated the smells, the screams, the curses. He would help in the worst places when others would flinch away. Yet John seemed aghast at whatever he had found in that crater. There was hatred in his eyes when he looked at the haggard old man. "You would abandon—" He choked on the acrid smoke and then barked her name once more. "Gina!" Gina's attention skimmed the broken high-rise, and she noticed for the first time the frightened faces now peering down at them. From every shadow and every corner, hundreds of people had begun to reveal themselves. They crept warily forward, one after another. But these survivors only watched. None made any attempt to move closer. In fact, many were armed. They looked afraid, angered even. Across the street, from where the old haggard man had returned, something glinted faintly, a pile of purple rubble. The color was out of place. "Curse," the haggard old man had said. It looked as though everything purple had been thrown there to be burned. There were canisters of various fuels, an expensive commodity not often wasted in such a way. Yet the canisters seemed to have been emptied and had been carelessly tossed to the side there as well. She could smell the putrid odors faintly through her scarf. Had that old man been hurrying to light it all on fire when they had appeared from the storm? What had they interrupted? Slowly, Gina began moving toward her husband, her unease growing. Her steps began to slow as the thing in the crater, or in the center of the crater, began to take form through the smoke and the snow. It was small and broken, the thing beneath John's torn coat. She saw a hand, a tiny, pale hand. The delicate little fingers, which were covered in ash and soot and snow, curled almost imperceptibly. Gina stopped in her tracks as horror washed through her. A little girl, she realized. A beautiful little girl with midnight hair lay there, and she was covered in so much ash. Her skin was utterly pale, and her lips were tinged with blue. Gina gasped, and tears suddenly rose to choke her. She blinked to clear her vision as she stared at the little girl, who had such wan, porcelain-like skin. The child was out in the cold, alone. And she was in the street, where she should have been found easily, and these people had done nothing for her. To a mother such as herself, the act of leaving any child to the cold was unforgivable. She felt a familiar ache in her belly, an emptiness, sorrow such as none she had ever felt but once, and it echoed the look upon John's face in that moment. Now Gina understood why her husband had been so taken aback. He must have already seen several of these people keeping their distance while the child lay there, abandoned to a cold and lonely death. Now she understood his murderous look. It was against everything he stood for, against his very identity, to leave a child to die alone. Gina's feet began to move, and then she was running. She clutched Jamie closer as she reached John, and she slid to the ground at his side. She grabbed his pack from him and urgently began rummaging through it as he picked up the little girl carefully. He checked gingerly to see if this child had or was injured in any way, but she did not appear to have any wounds. The little girl didn't have the appearance or the smell of a sick one either. Gina wiped the cold tears from her eyes with the backs of her hands as they shook, and she turned the bag upside down to remove a thin shawl. It wouldn't be enough to warm the girl, she realized. It would not do. Instead, Gina quickly began to remove her own coat, which was much warmer than John's. The child didn't seem to be breathing when John lifted her ever so gently and brushed her dark hair back from her tiny face. Her head lolled as his fingers felt for a pulse. Gina cupped the sweet girl's cheek, and she looked up and saw the crease in John's brow. She looks relatively unharmed. I don't think she's gone just yet, he told her. This ash may be the only reason she isn't dead yet. Some of it's still lukewarm. He pulled the child's tiny body against his to share his own warmth as Gina handed him her own coat to wrap about them. The young one wasn't moving. Put on my coat. It's too cold for you to be without it, Gina. Gina shook her head with a grimace and wrapped John's coat over his shoulders as he shivered fiercely. Get her warm first. Her numb fingers formed the words as quickly as they could. How strong is her pulse? She shrugged the tattered shawl over herself a moment later. The cold pierced it, as unyielding as the sharp, slender pugio that she carried. The frigid wind seeped through the garment in waves until it had gripped her ribs and she had started shivering. She clutched Jamie closer to protect him from that merciless cold. My hands are too numb. I can't tell whether she has a pulse. John grimaced worriedly, flexing and shaking his hand to try to get the blood flowing freely again. Gina took his hand between both of hers and breathed on his fingers. She rubbed his frozen digits between her palms, praying it would heat them even a little. She doubted did it much good at all, but it was better to try than to do nothing. Half her clothes have been burnt away, he said. John withdrew his hand as Gina nodded to a singed white garment which might have been a child's dress, or a shroud. He disturbed it, took it in his fingers. To Gina, it looked frighteningly like the shrouds they used to cover the dead in Five Tower, except it was white. And a white shroud in this city was the sign of the cursed, the shamed, the unwanted. John sucked in his breath. His expression clouded with anger as he realized what it really was. A shroud, Gina, he told her. Never mind that she wasn't given a proper dark color. This means these people intended for her to die here. They weren't going to leave here not to rot once she was dead. They weren't even going to bury her. He was very angry. They left her out here on purpose. She's not dead, is she? Gina sighed. She doesn't seem to be breathing. John looked down at the girl as his fingers pressing against the artery in her neck once more. She's alive, he said, but her heartbeat feels very weak. As though his words had breathed life into the child, the young one stirred. Her chest rose and fell with a feeble, wheezing cough, and her eyelids fluttered weakly. Tears welled in the young thing's lashes and glittered among the snowflakes, and then they began to freeze in thin trails upon her cheeks. She wept, her voice splitting as her head lolled back. John brushed her frosted midnight hair from her pale, waxen face. The sound she had uttered had been a long, cracking wail, and it was filled with so much anguish that Gina had to shut her eyes and turn her head away to take a deep, faltering breath to keep that sound from breaking her into wretched, shivering pieces. Anger flashed hot through Gina's belly at that sound. Only monsters would leave a child to die in a blizzard. "We are not alone," Gina signed discreetly, using her chin to motion to the buildings around them. The sound of sorrow scraped along her own throat as a sob lodged there. "Shh," she said to her son as he stirred restlessly against the cold. Another violent shiver stole through her own thin frame. Some of the city's people had crept closer. Clutched in their hands, she could make out clubs and several twisted links of rebar and splinters of wood driven through with nails and other objects. "Let it die!" came the hacked, angry voice of some woman from among the crowd. Upon their faces, Gina could see such ire written. Gina gripped her gun and flipped the safety mechanism, and John slid his knife from its sheath once more. He put the knife across his knee, just in case.
"The woman has a gun,"
someone muttered. Gina could hardly hear him. "She can't shoot all of us," another said bitterly. "What happened here?" John whispered as he studied the threatening mob and the wreckage about them. John realized he, too, was unsure if these people would try to attack them. Gina realized, sorry. "I told you to let it die," said the angered old man from before. "Let it die, I said. Let it die after all it's done here." The elders scrabbled back when the tall, dark man, clutching a thin, black staff, brushed past him, moving him gently to the side so that he could exit the cave-like entrance of one of their snow tunnels. "Move, Drago," said the tall man quietly to the old one. Drago's long, filthy fingers shot out and wrapped around the other man's heavily padded wrist over the stripe of red fox fur there. He clung to the man with both hands, shaking his head wildly. Don't go near the child," he squawked. "Don't do it, Tyre. Not after what it done to the others. Kale said to let it die after what it done." "I'm not getting near the child, Drago. Let me go. Easy, old man." Drago's drooping, vulture-like chin wobbled as he stared up at Tyre, who carelessly swung the oiled staff up and over his shoulder. A long, silent moment passed between the two, and then the old man finally lowered his eyes and let go. Drago brushed away some of the sparkles that had begun to show at the corners of his wrinkled eyes, and he looked away to hide the rest. "It'll kill you if you get too close. I won't mourn you, Tyre. I won't. Your mammon, mayhap, but not you. I'll put a violet shroud up on your dead body, give you the color it murdered half the city with. Every honorable man and woman will spit on your open grave just to keep your dishonor raw." With that, the old man turned his back and disappeared into the dim snow tunnel for good. Tyre shook his head, his grip tightening upon his black heartwood staff, his fingers finding and closing around the intricately carved wildcat across its center. He waded through the snow toward the strangers, and he stepped over the dead with practiced respect. The couple seemed to take notice of the bodies under the drifts for the first time as they held that accursed child like a fragile spring flower. Worry pooled in both pairs of their suspicious, glittering blue eyes. The woman stared at the dead longer, but her gaze was just as hard and just as wary as the man's. Tyre saw the pack they had shrugged off. He saw the gun and the wickedly lengthy gutting knife. The two expected a fight. They almost had the look of scavengers about them, but he wasn't sure whether they were that or worse. They could have been with the descendants of the moon, but for the baby she held. "You came to scavenge, that right?" He swung the black staff in a loose arc and studied the shrapnel about them for a second. He then hefted the staff's thin trunk over his shoulder again, letting it rest. It was the smallest warning to them that if he so decided, all he had to do was signal his men. The gun angled toward him slowly in the woman's left hand. She held her baby close with her other arm and flicked her wrist and fingers rapidly. The scruffy, shivering man near her remained unmoved, except to turn his head to watch the furious motions she made and nod to her. He returned a few calm signs as well. Tyre did not understand what they were saying to each other, but he could guess it was about him and about what their next move would be. "I know you speak," he said to the man. "I do," said John, placing his hand gently upon the boy's head and then the woman's cheek, probably to let her know they would be all right. "I'm John Ivan, and this is my wife, Gina, our son, Jamie. I'm a certified field doctor, a marked servant of the glass chain." Tyre started at that. He listened as John continued evenly. "We didn't come to rob you. We've come to assess the situation and help. I work with the enforcers on occasion, and they have offered their assistance should you require it. We were on my way to my new post, supposed to make a stop to meet with an associate by the name of Amos Shipwright. But we saw the explosion 3 nights ago. Several of my associates are coming as well, just a day or so behind. We were the first to leave the envoy. We've run out of food, however, and I would like to trade my services for it." "Amos Shipwright," repeated Tyre. "He and his passers-through come from the dwelling of the Regency for Black Temple. Trained in Isold, I do believe." "Yes, Isold." "He is no longer welcome. None of you are welcome any longer." "I'm aware," said John. "We would not have trespassed except that we thought to help. The situation seemed to us quite dire." John glanced upward as more glass fell from above. It did not fall silently, but cracked loudly as it struck the oil-black ground that was the crater. Neither the field doctor nor his woman flinched. And it seems we were correct. Gina set her gun down and placed her hand upon the little girl's cheek. The woman's mothering instincts were ferocious. The glare she gave Tyre, warning him not to approach them, made a small part of him recognize she was the bigger threat here, not her husband. She would kill anyone she perceived as a threat simply because the child had been left to die in the cold. John seemed to be more hopeful for a trade. She signed something to John, and he nodded. "I know we need to move her out in the open," he said. She then pulled his pack closer and began rummaging through it again. "If you are smart," Tyre said evenly, "you will leave her be. The child is dying, and good riddance, too, as far as everyone here is concerned." John was angered by Tyre's warning. Leave her to die? And just what would her parents say to that? Tyre replied coldly, "Parents? Not here, no. She has no family here, unless they were blown up with the rest of ours. She is not one of us, and we are not claiming her. No one here wants her to live, not after what she has done. Not just because of the deaths, either. The strange ones who were brought here by that group of enforcers, the same sentence has been issued for them." It was difficult for Tyre not to spit the word enforcer without any venom. He heard the angry sound that scraped through his raw throat just then, and he bit off the oath that rose before it was spoken aloud. "She is responsible for a lot, and in too short a time." "Why was she left to the cold?" demanded John. The edge in his voice was growing sharper. "You're saying it wasn't some sort of sickness?" "No, it is much worse than that." Gina's lips curled into a snarl, but she said nothing as she pulled from the pack a rather scratched, mottled old bottle whose label had faded long ago. She twisted at the waist, shielding it from Tyre, but he saw it still. His fingers gripped the handle of the staff tighter. She paid him little apparent attention as she hid it, and then pulled out a scuffed black thermos and unscrewed the lid. Steam rose from the lukewarm contents as she poured the fluid into the lid. The woman moved closer to her husband to administer tenderly to the girl, and she eased the child's head up so that she could place whatever the concoction was into the girl's mouth. John took the steaming cup from her, and he placed it gingerly against the child's blue lips himself to keep it from spilling. The girl began coughing, and that dark liquid seeped from her lips. Alder root, Tyre realized when he smelled the familiar acrid note on the cold wind. It was a rare commodity, a young species that seemed to have endless uses. It was good for blood flow and revitalization. Because of its warming effects, it was ideal for snowy climates such as the ones he had been born to. The plant was rare to see even in his homeland. How surprised he was to smell the leaves here. The child began to cry again, although her voice was but a broken sound. Still, she was not shivering. She should have been. Tyre knew, especially with a good dose of alderate. The child should have felt the cold or been dead already from the temperature. "Shh," said John, wiping the girl's cheek clean. "It's all right, little one. We have you. You will be warm soon, I promise. Drink as much as you can. It'll help tremendously." Gina picked up her gun and pointed it at Tyre when he stepped forward. John grabbed his knife instinctively at his wife's motion. Tyre stopped when he was merely a meter from them. He knelt there, held out his hands in a gesture of peace. He looked over his shoulder cautiously, briefly, and then he looked down at the child, at the tiny creature who had murdered so many. John pulled long strands of frosty midnight hair from the girl's face. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she looked straight into Tyre's eyes. It felt as though she were staring at his bare soul. She didn't cringe at the anger she saw in him either. She just looked at him with an expression as innocent as could be, even though he, like every other soul in Five Tower, knew better than to trust such a face. She continued to study him. She took in his plaited braids, noted the details upon the chain he wore about his throat, assessed the tension in his fingers as he gripped the black staff. The child's curiosity gave way to confusion, as though she didn't know who he was or where they were. Her little brows drew together ever so slightly, and her gaze shifted briefly to the broken tower above before she returned her attention to him. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't in pain. She wasn't cold. She was simply confused, as though she had awakened but still thought the world was a dream. Gina looked down, and when she noticed the color of the girl's eyes, she gasped. Her reaction was the same as Tyre's own had been when he had first seen the accursed creature. The child's eyes were an intense green, as though a light burned within them. The color was brighter than it should have been in the shade of John's shadow. It was as though her soul literally dwelled within her gaze and burned there as a bright emerald fire. "She is not a normal child," Tyre whispered to them apologetically. "You should know that. She cannot be." "Isn't normal," John said bitterly, but he did not see the color of her eyes. He did not know that she should have been dead for how long she had been lying there, exposed to the blizzard, with nothing to eat or drink, and with nothing left to warm her but that accursed white shroud and the ash. "So you feel justified in leaving this girl out here to die? This shroud? I know what this color means in your city." John had clutched the burnt cloth as he said it. Now he threw it at Tyre, and it landed at his feet. Tyre clenched his teeth. "I've seen what superstitions do to the innocent," said John. "Because of those superstitions, otherwise good men stood by and did nothing when my wife was stabbed in the throat by a serial killer. He would have skinned her and gutted her too, just as he had her sisters and her brothers and her parents. The victim's always a witch, a demon. There's always something to justify it. And if you take one step closer, I will have to kill you. We may be here to help, but if you get closer, this won't end well for anyone, us or you or this city. You understand that we work for Black Temple. You know our words and what they mean. We are here to deliver mercy unless one among you does something to change that." Tyre studied the child. He gripped his staff tightly when she blinked. He saw a predator in her. He knew she would get this family killed if he let them take her, but then again, it would also mean she was no longer in Five Tower. He wouldn't have to watch the girl die a slow death anymore, gritting his teeth as he waited for the blizzard to claim her, as it should have, days ago. The Lord's order would no longer be in conflict with Tyer's late mother's words. "It's not her fault, Tyer," his mother had said. "Do not let them punish her for their sins. Send her away, my son. Send her away." Both his mother and his liege would have been honored, or would be honored in the end if these people took her. But he couldn't let these determined fools do so blindly, not without warning them first. "This is no superstition," said Tyer at last. "She has done something terrible. You do not understand. I do not know how long she has been here or where she came from, just that she caused this." He motioned to the ruined city about them. "She is not normal." Those eerie eyes of hers. He could feel them boring into him, reading him. His grip upon the staff tightened again. "My calling is to heal people," said John. "I'm good at it. Whether your people want her or not, we're going to help her. Every life should flourish, normal or not." Tyer felt part of himself sigh with relief over their ignorance. They intended to help regardless. At least they didn't seem to be child eaters. Not even one among the cult of the wolf would be so fiercely determined or care much whether she lived. Every child eater he had ever met had been a superstitious, paranoid, batty one. His warning would have sent them scurrying off in search of some other normal child, one that had no chance of passing a curse with the eating of it. "She was not born of this city. She is not of our people," said Tyer after a moment of deliberation. "I concede that it means we have no real say in your decision to help her." The words gave him quiet relief. It felt right to say them. The child shuddered weakly as her gaze passed from Tyer to John. Her small fingers curled around the gray fur collar of Gina's coat, as she seemed to wait for their decision. There was no hopeful look in her eyes. No dread, just quiet observation. "What's your name, little one?" John asked gently. Her mouth opened, but none of them could hear the name she uttered. He leaned closer, turned his head to hear her as she repeated.
"Nymeria,"
she whispered. Her voice was so fragile, so weak. It came hardly above a whisper. None of them realized what she was saying. "What is your family name?" Her eyelids drifted slowly downward.
"No memory."
She lost consciousness. She did not open her eyes again when John prodded her to try to remain awake. Tyer grimaced. "You need to take her from this city," he said quietly. "Do not tell a soul that I am the one who gave you permission. My liege Kaol has ordered that her death be slow and public. If he discovers I sent her with you, he will have you hunted and killed just to make sure she dies." He frowned thoughtfully. "But he will not do it if he thinks she is already dead." Tyer's fingers tightened over the cold staff as he made the quick decision he knew might later get him killed. For now, it would buy them all some time and free them of such a sin. "Listen, I offer mercy. I will make sure the watch at the west gate is lax. Take her when the horns blast, marking shift change in the morn. I will make sure Kaol's loyalists are distracted. His nephew Timothy will be glad to encourage her disappearance, and he will be quiet about it. He did not agree with Kaol's command and spoke loudest against it." Gina felt the tight grip of relief and anger loosen. At last, she nodded. She snapped her fingers so that John would look at her. "We'll take her with us in the morning, as he says," she said. "Tell them Mark will be here to help them tomorrow." "Are you sure you want to bring her?" John asked. "You don't want to try to find her family first?" Tyer waited silently as Gina shook her head. "Mark can help these people," she told her husband. "They do not want her here. We'll find her a home if she has no family to claim her. Are you sure you want to risk it? Tyre spoke as though he had some idea of what the conversation between them might be about. If you are considering whether to keep her or find a family for her, I would not trust anyone in or near this city. Most of the families living just outside Five Tower. He looked up at the broken towers above, as though the city's name had become nearly unbearable to say out loud. They bring in strange ones and trade them. The girls are treated the worst before they are sold. Some are treated to the wolf shadow priests. As you know, some of the girls are kept unbred, and their male offspring become a steady source of sacrifice for the descendants to consume. Alarm flashed in Gina's glittering blue eyes, and she looked down at the child her husband held before returning her gaze to Tyre. She nodded to show her appreciation in a way that Tyre could understand. She began signing to her husband again, and Tyre waited patiently for them to come to some agreement. She may as well become our daughter. Gregory stole our first, John, and I cannot have any more children. He took that from me. John winced, but he kept listening. I will not ever trust another soul with this little girl. She's precious and she needs us. And everything in my heart tells me we need to take her with us. Perhaps this is destiny, an answer to my prayers. A chance to raise a second child, for Jamie to have a sibling he would otherwise never have had. John nodded at last. All right, take out what medicine we have left so I can give it to him. He rose with little Nymeria cocooned protectively in his arms. He noticed how Tyre had risen and stepped away, his dark gaze following the girl suspiciously, as though she were diseased. John tossed a small bundle to the wary man. This is all the extra help we can offer at the moment in terms of medicine. You'll find several jars of potent antibiotics and various pain and fever-reducing remedies within. We haven't enough alderate to share. The girl needs it. I'll take a look at your wounded if you'll give us about a week's worth of food and water so that we can get to my assigned post more quickly. We'll then send the appropriate equipment your way. My associate Mark will be here tomorrow with more medicine since we already have gone through the rest of ours. That's all I can do for now. You won't be getting near anyone here with the girl, Tyre said. No one wants her. They will not want your ministrations after you have touched her either. But I will have a few things delivered to the gate for you. Consider it a fair trade. You are taking a curse from this city. Cale will be happier for it once his rage and his grief are gone. He would not want a single particle of dirt corrupted by her corpse. Then we will take her with us. Tyre considered his words for a moment, and he looked up into the windows of the remaining two buildings before finally nodding. Do not ever bring her back here. Ever. None here would mistake her for another, or another for her. I will not be able to stop the people of the city from killing her. It would be wisest to take her as far from here as you can. Gina nudged John's wrist. Ask him about the mountain of purple trash over there. What is all of that? John asked. He motioned to the pile of purple rubbish. A layer of white had already descended upon it like a shroud. Cale's orders. Everything purple is being purged from the city. Tyre eyed the crater, and he placed his hand over a red vein in the concrete. It was hot to the touch. Lay her close to this. It came from her, after all. She may be wanting some of it back. Periodically through Twitter and Instagram, I will be doing free signed book and signed art print giveaways for fans in the United States. The art is created by yours truly, same as the book itself. To enter the first giveaway, follow me and enter the hashtag TVC1 giveaway, and that's a number 1. My social media handle is 7bloodfire. The first winners will be decided mid-April of 2021, at which time I will make the announcement on my website. Contest details will also be noted on 7bloodfire.com. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up and share it on social media so our Leviathans family can get bigger. Yay! Thank you so much, guys.